Chapter 15 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 15.
"Since we are in for it," said Mr. Slocum the next morning, "put the case to them squarely."
Mr. Slocum's vertebrae had stiffened overnight. "Leave that to me, sir," Richard replied. "I have been shaping out in my mind a little speech which I flatter myself will cover the points. They have brought this thing upon themselves, and we are about to have the clearest of understandings. I never saw the men quieter."
"I don't altogether admire that. It looks as if they hadn't any doubt as to the issue."
"The clearest headed have no doubt. They know as well as you and I do the flimsiness of those resolutions. But the thick heads are in a fog. Every man naturally likes his pay increased. If a simple fellow is told 500 or 600 times that his wages ought to be raised, the idea is so agreeable and insidious that by and by he begins to believe himself grossly underpaid, though he may be getting twice what he is worth. He doesn't reason about it. That's the last thing he'll do for you. In this mood he lets himself be flown away by the breath of some loud-mouthed demagogue, who has no interest in the matter beyond hearing his own talk, and passing round the hat after the meeting is over. That is what has happened to our folks below. But they are behaving handsomely."
"Yes, and I don't like it."
Since 7 o'clock the most unimpeachable decorum had reigned in the workshops. It was now 9, and this brief dialogue had occurred between Mr. Slocum and Richard on the veranda, just as the latter was on the point of descending into the yard to have his talk with the men. The workshops, or rather the shed in which the workshops were, for it was one low structure, 18 or 20 feet wide and open on the west side, ran the length of the yard, and with the short extension at the southerly end formed the letter L. There were no partitions, an imaginary line separating the different gangs of workers. A person standing at the head of the building could make himself heard more or less distinctly in the remotest part. The grating lisp of the wet saws eating their way into the marble boulder, and the irregular quick taps of the 70 or 80 mallets were not suspended as Richard took his stand beside a tall funeral urn at the head of the principal workshop. After a second's faltering, he rapped smartly on the lip of the urn with the key of his studio door. Instantly every arm appeared paralyzed, and the men stood motionless, with the tools in their hands. Richard began in a clear but not loud voice, though it seemed to ring on the sudden silence. "Mr. Slocum has asked me to say a few words to you this morning about those resolutions and one or two other matters that have occurred to him in this connection. I am no speechmaker. I never learned that trade."
"Never learned any trade," muttered Durgin inaudibly.
"But I think I can manage some plain honest talk for straightforward men." Richard's exordium was listened to with painful attention. "In the first place," he continued, "I want to remind you, especially the newer men, that Slocum's Yard has always given steady work and prompt pay to Stillwater hands. No hand has ever been turned off without sufficient cause, or kept on through mere favoritism. Favors have been shown, but they have been shown to all alike. If anything has gone crooked, it has been straightened out as soon as Mr. Slocum knew of it. That has been the course of the yard in the past, and the proprietor doesn't want you to run away with the idea that that course is going to be changed. One change for the time being is going to be made at your own suggestion. From now on, until the 1st of September, this yard will close gates on Saturdays at 5 p.m. instead of 6 p.m. Several voices cried,
"Good for Slocum!" "Where's Slocum? Why don't Slocum speak for himself?" cried one voice.
"It is Mr. Slocum's habit," answered Richard, "to give his directions to me. I give them to the foreman, and the foreman to the shops. Mr. Slocum follows that custom on this occasion. With regard to the new scale of wages which the association has submitted to him, the proprietor refuses to accept it or any modification of it." A low murmur ran through the workshops. "What's a modification, sir?" asked Jemmy Wilson, stepping forward and scratching his left ear diffidently. "A modification," replied Richard, considerably embarrassed to give an instant definition, "is a
splitting of the difference by," shouted somebody in the third shop.
"Thank you," said Richard, glancing in the direction of his impromptu Webster's Unabridged. "Mr. Slocum does not propose to split the difference. The wages in every department are to be just what they are, neither more nor less. If anybody wishes to make a remark," he added, observing a restlessness in several of the men, "I beg he will hold on until I get through. I shall not detain you much longer, as the parson says, before he has reached the middle of his sermon. What I say now, I was charged to make particularly clear to you. It is this. In future Mr. Slocum intends to run Slocum's Yard himself. Neither you, nor I, nor the association will be allowed to run it for him. Sensation. Until now, the association has tied him down to 2 apprentices a year. From this hour out, Mr. Slocum will take on not 2 or 20, but 200 apprentices, if the business warrants it. The words were not clearly off Richard's lips when the foreman of the shop in which he was speaking picked up a couple of small drills and knocked them together with a sharp click. In an instant, the men laid aside their aprons, bundled up their tools, and marched out of the shed 2 by 2 in dead silence. The same click was repeated almost simultaneously in the second shop, and the same evolution took place. Then click, click, click went the drills, sounding fainter and fainter in the distant departments, and in less than 3 minutes there was not a soul left in Slocum's Yard except the orator of the day. Richard had anticipated some demonstration, either noisy or violent, perhaps both, but this solemn, orderly desertion dashed him. He stepped into the middle of the yard, and glancing up, beheld Margaret and Mr. Slocum standing on the veranda. Even at that distance he could perceive the pallor on one face and the consternation written all over the other. Hanging his head with sadness, Richard crossed the yard, which gave out mournful echoes to his footfalls, and swung to the large gate, nearly catching old Giles by the heel as he did so. Looking through the slats, he saw Lumley and Peterson hobbling arm in arm down the street, after more than 25 years of kindly treatment. "Move number 1," said Richard, lifting the heavy cross-piece into its place and fastening it with a wooden pin. "Now I must go and prop up Mr. Slocum." End of chapter 15. (16) of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 16. There is no solitude which comes so near being tangible as that of a vast empty workshop, crowded a moment since. The busy, intense life that has gone from it mysteriously leaves behind enough of itself to make the stillness poignant. One might imagine the invisible ghost of doomed toil wandering from bench to bench, and noiselessly fingering the dropped tools, still warm from the workman's palm. Perhaps this impalpable presence is the artisan's anxious thought, stolen back to brood over the uncompleted task. Though Mr. Slocum had spoken lightly of Slocum's Yard with only 1 workman in it, when he came to contemplate the actual fact, he was struck by the pathos of it, and the resolution with which he awoke that morning began to desert him. "The worst is over," exclaimed Richard, joining his 2 friends on the veranda, "and everything went smoother than I expected." "Everything went, sure enough," said Mr. Slocum gloomily. "They all went. Old Giles and Lumley and everybody." "We somewhat expected that, you know." "Yes, I expected it, and wasn't prepared for it." "It was very bad," said Richard, shaking his head. The desertion of Giles and his superannuated mates especially touched Mr. Slocum. "Bad is no word. It was damnable." "Oh, papa!" "Pardon me, dear. I couldn't help it. When a man's pensioners throw him over, he must be pretty far gone." "The undertow was too strong for them, sir, and they were swept away with the rest, and they all but promised to stay. They will be the very first to come back." "Of course we shall have to take the old fellows on again," said Mr. Slocum, relenting characteristically. "Never!" cried Richard. "I wish I had some of your grit." "I have none to spare. To tell the truth, when I stood up there to speak, with every eye working on me like a half-inch drill, I would have sold myself at a low figure." "But you were a perfect what's-his-name, Demosthenes," said Mr. Slocum with a faint smile. "We could hear you." "I don't believe Demosthenes ever moved an audience as I did mine," cried Richard gaily. "If his orations produced a like effect, I am certain that the Grecian lecture bureau never sent him twice to the same place." "I don't think, Richard, I would engage you over again." "I am sure Richard spoke very well," interrupted Margaret. "His speech was short." "Say shortened, Margaret, for I hadn't got through when they left." "No, I will not jest about it. It is too serious for jesting. What is to become of the families of all these men suddenly thrown out of employment?" "They threw themselves out, Mag," said her father. "That does not mend the matter, papa. There will be great destitution and suffering in the village, with every mill closed, and they are all going to close, Bridget says. Thank heaven! that this did not happen in the winter."
"They always pick their weather," observed Mr. Slocum.
"It will not be for long," said Richard encouragingly. "Our own hands and the spinners, who had no ground for complaint, will return to work shortly, and the managers of the iron mills will have to yield a point or two. In a week at the outside everything will be running smoothly, and on a sounder foundation than before. I believe the strike will be an actual benefit to everybody in the end." By dint of such arguments and his own sanguine temperament, Richard succeeded in reassuring Mr. Slocum for the time being, though Richard did not hide from himself the gravity of the situation. There was a general strike in the village. 800 men were without work. That meant, or would mean in a few days, 2,000 or 3,000 women and children without bread. It does not take the wolf long to reach a poor man's door when it is left ajar. The trades union had a fund for emergencies of this sort, and some outside aid might be looked for, but such supplies are in their nature precarious and soon exhausted. It is a noticeable feature of strikes that the moment a workman's pay stops, his living expenses increase. Even the more economical becomes improvident. If he has money, the tobacco shop and the tavern are likely to get more of it than the butcher's cart. The prolonged strain is too great to be endured without stimulant. End of chapter 16. (17) of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 17. During the first and second days of the strike, Stillwater presented an animated and even a festive appearance. Throngs of operatives in their Sunday clothes strolled through the streets, or lounged at the corners chatting with other groups. Some wandered into the suburbs, and lay in the long grass under the elms. Others, again, though these were few, took to the turnpike or the railroad track and tramped across country. It is needless to say that the bar-room of the tavern was crowded from early morning down to the hour when the law compelled Mr. Snelling to shut off his gas, after which John Brown's soul could be heard marching on in the darkness, through various crooked lanes and alleys until nearly daybreak. Among the earliest to scent trouble in the air was Han Lin, the Chinaman before mentioned. He kept a small laundry in Mud Lane, where his name was painted perpendicularly on a light of glass in the basement window of a tenement house. Han Lin intended to be buried some day in a sky-blue coffin in his own land, and have a dozen packs of firecrackers decorously exploded over his remains. In order to reserve himself for this and other ceremonies involving the burning of a great quantity of gilt paper, he quietly departed for Boston at the first sign of popular discontent. As Dexter described it, Han Lin coiled up his pigtail, put 40 grams of rice in a yaller bag, enough to last him a month, and toddled off in his 2-story wooden shoes. He could scarcely have done a wiser thing, for poor Han Lin's laundry was turned wrong side out within 36 hours afterwards. The strike was popular. The spirit of it spread, as fire and fever and all elemental forces spread. The 2 apprentices in Brackett's bakery had a dozen minds about striking that first morning. The younger lad, Joe Wiggin, plucked up courage to ask Brackett for a day off, and was lucky enough to dodge a piece of dough weighing nearly 4 pounds. Brackett was making bread while the sun shone. He knew that before the week was over there would be no cash customers, and he proposed then to shut up shop. On the third and fourth days there was no perceptible fall in the barometer. Trade was brisk with Snelling, and a brass band was playing national airs on a staging erected on the green in front of the post office. Nightly meetings took place at Grimsey's Hall, and the audiences were good-humored and orderly. Torrini advanced some utopian theories touching a universal distribution of wealth, which were listened to attentively, but failed to produce deep impression. "That's a healthy idea of Torrini's about dividing up property," said Jemmy Wilson. "I've heard it afore, but it's singler. I never knowed a fellow with any property to have that idea." "There's a great deal in it, I can tell ye," replied Michael Hennessy, with a well-blackened Woodstock pipe between his teeth and his hands tucked under his coat-tails. "Isn't there, Mr. Stevens?" When Michael had on his bottle-green swallow-tailed coat with the brass buttons, he invariably assumed a kind of lofty air of ceremony in addressing his companions. "It is sorter pleasant to look at," returned Stevens, "but it don't seem to me an idea that would work. Suppose that, after all the property was divided, a fresh shipload of your friends was to land at New York or Boston. Would there be a new deal?" No, sir, by no means, exclaimed Michael excitedly. The fairness is counted out.
But you're a foreigner yourself, Mike.
Am I then? Bedad, I'm not. I'm a real American, no nothing.
Well, Mike, said Stevens maliciously, when it comes to regular division of lands and greenbacks in the United States, I go in for the Chinese having their share.
The Chinese! Shouted Michael. Oh, mercy, Mr. Stevens. You wouldn't be for dividing with them blacker skites.
Yes, with them, as well as the rest, returned Stevens dryly.
Meanwhile, the directors and stockholders of the various mills took counsel in a room at the rear of the National Bank. Mr. Slocum, following Richard's advice, declined to attend the meeting in person or to allow his name to figure on the list of vice presidents.
Why should we hitch our good cause to their doubtful one? Reflected Richard. We have no concessions or proposals to make. When our men are ready to come back to us, they will receive just wages and fair treatment. They know that. We do not want to fight the molders. Let the iron mills do their own fighting. And Richard stolidly employed himself in taking an account of stock, and forwarding by express to their destination the 10 or 12 carved mantelpieces that happily completed the last contract. Then his responsibility shrunk to winding up the office clock and keeping Mr. Slocum firmly on his legs. The latter was by far the more onerous duty, for Mr. Slocum ran down 2 or 3 times in the course of every 24 hours, while the clock, once wound, was fixed for the day. "If I could only have a good set of Waltham works put into your father," said Richard to Margaret, after one of Mr. Slocum's relapses, "he would go better." "Poor papa, he's not a fighter like you." "Your father is what I call a belligerent non-combatant." Richard was seeing a great deal of Margaret these days. Mr. Slocum had invited him to sleep in the studio until the excitement was past. Margaret was afraid to have him take that long walk between the yard and his lodgings in Lime Street, and then her father was an old man to be without any protection in the house in such untoward times. So Richard slept in the studio, and had his plate at table, like one of the family. This arrangement was favorable to many a stolen 5 minutes with Margaret, in the hall or on the staircase. In these fortuitous moments he breathed an atmosphere that sustained him in his task of dispelling Mr. Slocum's recurrent fits of despondency. Margaret had her duties, too, at this period, and the forenoons were sacred to them. One morning, as she passed down the street with a small wicker basket on her arm, Richard said to Mr. Slocum, "Margaret has joined the strikers." The time had already come to Stillwater when many a sharp-faced little urchin, as dear to the warm, deep bosom that had nursed it as though it were a crown prince, would not have had a crust to gnaw if Margaret Slocum had not joined the strikers. Sometimes her heart drooped on the way home from these errands, upon seeing how little of the misery she could ward off. On her rounds there was one cottage in a squalid lane where the children asked for bread in Italian. She never omitted to halt at that door. "Is it quite prudent for Margaret to be going about so?" queried Mr. Slocum.
"She is perfectly safe," said Richard, "as safe as a Sister of Charity, which she is." Indeed, Margaret might then have gone loaded with diamonds through the street at midnight. There was not a rough man in Stillwater who would not have reached forth an arm to shield her.
"It is costing me nearly as much as it would to carry on the yard," said Mr. Slocum, "but I never put out any stamps more willingly." "You never took a better contract, sir, than when you agreed to keep Margaret's basket filled. It is an investment in real estate hereafter." "I hope so," answered Mr. Slocum, "and I know it's a good thing now."
Of the morals of Stillwater at this time, or at any time, the less said the better. But out of the slime and ooze below sprang the white flower of charity. The 5th day fell on a Sabbath, and the churches were crowded. The Reverend Arthur Langley selected his text from St. Matthew, chapter 22, verse 21, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's." But as he did not make it quite plain which was Caesar, the Trades Union or the Manantowona Iron Works, the sermon went for nothing, unless it could be regarded as a hint to those persons who had stolen a large piece of belting from the Dana Mills. On the other hand, Father O'Meara that morning bravely told his children to conduct themselves in an orderly manner while they were out of work, or they would catch it in this world and in the next. On the 6th day, a keen observer might have detected a change in the atmosphere. The streets were thronged as usual, and the idlers still wore their Sunday clothes, but the holiday buoyancy of the earlier part of the week had evaporated. A turnout on the part of one of the trades, though it was accompanied by music and a banner with a lively inscription, failed to arouse general enthusiasm. A serious and even a sullen face was not rare among the crowds that wandered aimlessly up and down the village. On the seventh day it required no penetration to see the change. There was decidedly less good-natured chaffing and more drunkenness, though Snelling had invoked popular contumely and decimated his barroom by refusing to trust for drinks. Brackett had let his ovens cool, and his shutters were up. The treasury of the trades union was nearly drained, and there were growlings that too much had been fooled away on banners and a brass band for the Iron Men's Parade the previous forenoon. It was when Brackett's eye sighted the banner with bread or blood on it that he had put up his shutters. Torrini was now making violent harangues at Grimsey's Hall to largely augmented listeners, whom his words irritated without convincing. Shut off from the tavern, the men flocked to hear him and the other speakers, for born orators were just then as thick as unripe whortleberries. There was nowhere else to go. At home were reproaches that maddened, and darkness, for the kerosene had given out. Though all the trades had been swept into the movement, it is not to be understood that every workman was losing his head. There were men who owned their cottages and had small sums laid by in the savings bank, who had always sent their children to the district school and listened themselves to at least one of Mr. Langley's sermons or one of Father O'Meara's discourses every Sunday. These were anchored to good order. They neither frequented the bar-room nor attended the conclaves at Grimsey's Hall, but deplored as deeply as anyone the spirit that was manifesting itself. They would have returned to work now, if they had dared. To this class belonged Stevens. "Why don't you come up to the hall nights?" asked Durgin, accosting him on the street one afternoon. "You'd run a chance of hearing me hold forth some of these evenings." "You've answered your own question, William. I shouldn't like to see you making an idiot of yourself." "This is a square fight between labor and capital," returned Durgin with dignity, "and every man ought to take a hand in it." "William," said Stevens meditatively, "do you know about the Siamese twins?" "What about 'em? They're dead, ain't they?" replied Durgin with surprise. "I believe so, but when they was alive, if you was to pinch one of those fellows, the other fellow would sing out. If you was to black the eye of the left-hand chap, the right-hand chap wouldn't have been able to see for a week. When either of 'em fetched the other a clip, he knocked himself down. Labor and capital is joined just as those two was. When you've got this fact well into your skull, William, I shall be pleased to listen to your ideas at Grimsey's Hall or anywhere else." Such conservatism as Stevens, however, was necessarily swept out of sight for the moment. The wealthier citizens were in a state bordering on panic, all but Mr. Lemuel Shackford. In his flapping linen duster, for the weather was very sultry now, Mr. Shackford was seen darting excitedly from street to street and hovering about the feverish crowds, like the stormy petrel wheeling on the edges of a gale. Usually as chary of his sympathies as of his gold, he astonished everyone by evincing an abnormal interest in the strikers. The old man declined to put down anything on the subscription paper then circulating, but he put down his sympathies to any amount. He held no stock in the concerns involved. He hated Slocum, and he hated the directors of the Minnetowana Iron Works. The least he hoped was that Roland Slocum would be laid out. So far the strikers had committed no overt act of note, unless it was the demolition of Honlin's laundry. Stubbs, the provision dealer, had been taught the rashness of exposing samples of potatoes in his doorway, and the tonsorial emporium of Professor Brown, a colored citizen, had been invaded by two humorists, who, after having their hair curled, refused to pay for it, and the professor had been too agitated to insist. The story transpiring, 10 or 12 of the boys had dropped in during the morning and got shaved on the same terms. "By golly, gentlemen," expostulated the professor, "if this yah thing goes on, this darky will be clean clear out 'fore the week's done." No act of real violence had been perpetrated as yet, but with bands of lawless men roaming over the village at all hours of the day and night, the situation was critical. The wheel of what small social life there was in Stillwater had ceased to revolve. With the single exception of Lemuel Shackford, the more respectable inhabitants kept indoors as much as practicable. From the first, neither Mr. Craggie nor Lawyer Perkins had gone to the hotel to consult the papers in the reading room, and Mr. Pinkham did not dare to play on his flute of an evening. The Reverend Arthur Langley found it politic to do but little visiting in the parish. His was not the opinion to buffet with a wind like this, and indeed he was not explicitly called upon to do so. He sat sorrowfully in his study day by day, preparing the weekly sermon, a gentle, pensive person, inclined in the best of weather to melancholia. If Mr. Langley had gone into arboriculture instead of into the ministry, he would have planted nothing but weeping willows. In the meantime, the mill directors continued their deliberations in the bank building, and had made several abortive attempts to effect an arrangement with the leaders of the union. This seemed every hour less possible and more necessary. On the afternoon of the 7th day of the strike, a crowd gathered in front of the residence of Mr. Alexander, the superintendent of the Miantowona Iron Works, and began groaning and hooting. Mr. Alexander sought out Mr. Craggie and urged him, as a man of local weight and one accustomed to addressing the populace, to speak a few words to the mob. That was setting Mr. Craggie on the horns of a cruel dilemma. He was afraid to disoblige the representative of so powerful a corporation as the Miantowona Iron Works, but he equally dreaded to risk his popularity with 700 or 800 voters. So, like the crafty chancellor in Tennyson's poem, he dallied with his golden chain, and smiling, put the question by.
"Drat the man," muttered Mr. Craggie. "Does he want to blast my whole political career? I can't pitch into our adopted countrymen."
There was a blot on the escutcheon of Mr. Craggie, which he was very anxious not to have uncovered by any chance in these latter days, his ancient affiliation with the deceased Native American party. The mob dispersed without doing damage, but the fact that it had collected and had shown an ugly temper sent a thrill of apprehension through the village. Mr. Slocum came in a great flurry to Richard.
"This thing ought to be stopped,"
said Mr. Slocum. "I agree to that," replied Richard, bracing himself not to agree to anything else.
"If we were to drop that stipulation as to the increase of apprentices, no doubt many of the men would give over insisting on an advance."
"Our only salvation is to stick to our right to train as many workmen as we choose. The question of wages is of no account compared with that. The rate of wages will adjust itself."
"If we could manage it somehow with the marble workers," suggested Mr. Slocum, "that would demoralize the other trades, and they'd be obliged to fall in."
"I don't see that they lack demoralization."
"If something isn't done, they'll end up by knocking in our front doors or burning us all up."
"Let them."
"It is very well to say, 'let them,'" exclaimed Mr. Slocum petulantly, "when you haven't any front door to be knocked in."
"But I have you and Margaret to consider, if there were actual danger. When anything like violence threatens, there's an honest shoulder for every one of the 150 muskets in the armory."
"Those muskets might get on the wrong shoulders."
"That isn't likely. You do not seem to know, sir, that there is a strong guard at the armory day and night."
"I was not aware of that."
"It is a fact all the same," said Richard, and Mr. Slocum went away easier in his mind, and remained so 2 or 3 hours. On the 8th, 9th, and 10th days the clouds lay very black along the horizon. The marble workers, who began to see their mistake, were reproaching the foundrymen with enticing them into coalition, and the spinners were hot in their denunciations of the molders. Ancient personal antagonisms that had been slumbering started to their feet. Torrini fell out of favor, and in the midst of one of his finest perorations uncomplimentary missiles, selected from the animal kingdom, had been thrown at him. The grand torchlight procession of the night of the 9th culminated in a disturbance in which many men got injured, several badly, and the windows of Brackett's bakery were stove in. A point of light had pierced the darkness. The trades were quarreling among themselves. The selectmen had sworn in special constables among the citizens, and some of the more retired streets were now patrolled after dark, for there had been threats of incendiarism. Bishop's stables burst into flames one midnight, whether fired intentionally or accidentally was not known, but the giant bellows at Dana's Mills was slit, and 2 belts were cut at the Miantowona Iron Works that same night. At this juncture, a report that out-of-town hands were coming to replace the strikers acted on the public mind like petroleum on fire. A large body of workmen assembled near the railway station, to welcome them. There was another rumor, which caused the marble workers to stare at each other aghast. It was to the effect that Mr. Slocum, having long meditated retiring from business, had now decided to do so, and was consulting with Wyndham, the keeper of the greenhouse, about removing the division wall and turning the marble yard into a peach garden. This was an unlooked-for solution of the difficulty. Stillwater without any Slocum's marble yard was chaos come again.
"Good Lord, boys!" cried Piggott. "If Slocum should do that!"
Meanwhile, Snelling's bar had been suppressed by the authorities, and a posse of policemen, borrowed from South Millville, occupied the premises. Knots of beetle-browed men, no longer in holiday gear, but chiefly in their shirt-sleeves, collected from time to time at the head of the main street and glowered threateningly at the single policeman pacing the porch of the tavern. The Stillwater Greys were under arms in the armory over Dundon's drugstore. The thoroughfare had ceased to be safe for anyone, and Margaret's merciful errands were necessarily brought to an end. How the poor creatures who had depended on her bounty now continued to exist was a sorrowful problem. Matters were at this point when on the morning of the 13th day Richard noticed the cadaverous face of a man peering into the yard through the slats of the main gate. Richard sauntered down there, with his hands in his pockets. The man was old Giles, and with him stood Lumley and Peterson, gazing thoughtfully at the sign outside. No admittance except on business. The roughly lettered clapboard, which they had heedlessly passed 1,000 times, seemed to have taken a novel significance to them.
"What's wanted there?"
"We was looking around for a job, Mr. Shackford."
"We are not taking on any hands at present."
"Didn't know but you was. Somebody said you was."
"Somebody was mistaken."
"Perhaps tomorrow or next day?"
"Rather doubtful, Giles."
"Mr. Slocum ain't going to give up business, is he?"
"Why shouldn't he, if it doesn't pay? The business is carried on for his amusement and profit. When the profit stops, it won't be amusing any longer. Mr. Slocum is not going to run the yard for the sake of the Marble Workers' Association. He would rather drive a junk cart. He might be allowed to steer that himself."
"Oh."
"Good morning, Giles."
"Morning, Mr. Shackford."
Richard rushed back to Mr. Slocum.
"The strike is broken, sir."
"What do you mean?"
"The thing has collapsed. The tide is turning and has washed in a whole lot of dead wood."
"Thank God!"
cried Mr. Slocum.
An hour or so later, a deputation of 4, consisting of Stevens, Denevan, Durgin, and Piggott, waited upon Mr. Slocum in his private office, and offered, on behalf of all the departments, to resume work at the old rates. Mr. Slocum replied that he had not objected to the old rates, but the new, and that he accepted their offer conditionally.
"You have overlooked one point, Mr. Stevens."
"Which one, sir?"
"The apprentices."
"We thought you might not insist there, sir."
"I insist on conducting my own business in my own way."
The voice was the voice of Slocum, but the backbone was Richard.
"Then, sir, the association don't object to a reasonable number of apprentices." "How many is that?"
"As many as you want, I expect, sir," said Stevens, shuffling his feet.
"Very well, Stevens. Go round to the front gate, and Mr. Shackford will let you in."
There were 2 doors to the office, one leading into the yard, and the other, by which the deputation had entered and was now making its exit, opened upon the street. Richard heaved a vast sigh of relief as he took down the beam securing the principal entrance. "Good morning, boys," he chirped, with a smile as bright as newly minted gold. "I do hope you enjoyed yourselves." The quartet ducked their heads bashfully, and Stevens replied,
"Can't speak for the others, Mr. Shackford, but I never enjoyed myself worse."
Piggott lingered a moment behind the rest, and looking back over his shoulder said,
"That peach garden was what fetched us."
Richard gave a loud laugh, for the peach garden had been a horticultural invention of his own. In the course of the forenoon, the majority of the hands presented themselves at the office, dropping into the yard in gangs of 5 or 6, and nearly all were taken on. To dispose definitely of Lumley, Giles, and Peterson, they were not taken on at Slocum's yard, though they continued to be, directly or indirectly, Slocum's pensioners, even after they were retired to the town farm. Once more the chisel sounded merrily under the long shed. That same morning the spinners went back to the mules, but the molders held out until nightfall, when it was signified to them that their demands would be complied with. The next day the steam whistles of the Miantowona Ironworks and Dana's Mills sent the echoes flying beyond that undulating line of pines and hemlocks which half encircles Stillwater, and falls away loosely on either side, like an unclasped girdle. A calm, as if from the cloudless blue sky that arched it day after day, seemed to drift down upon the village. Han Lin, with no more facial expression than an orange, suddenly reappeared on the streets, and went about repairing his laundry unmolested. The children were playing in the sunny lanes again, unafraid, and mother sat on doorsteps in the summer twilights, singing softly to the baby in arm. There was meat on the table, and the tea kettle hummed comfortably at the back of the stove. The very winds that rustled through the fragrant pines and wandered fitfully across the vivid green of the salt marshes breathed peace and repose. Then, one morning, this blissful tranquility was rudely shattered. Old Mr. Lemuel Shackford had been found murdered in his own house in Welch's Court. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 18. The general effect on Stillwater of Mr. Shackford's death, and the peculiar circumstances attending the tragedy, have been set forth in the earlier chapters of this narrative. The influence which that event exerted upon several persons then but imperfectly known to the reader is now to occupy us. On the conclusion of the strike, Richard had returned, in the highest spirits, to his own rooms in Lime Street, but the quiet week that followed found him singularly depressed. His nerves had been strung to their utmost tension during those 13 days of suspense. He had assumed no light responsibility in the matter of closing the yard, and there had been moments when the task of sustaining Mr. Slocum had appeared almost hopeless. Now that the strain was removed, a reaction set in, and Richard found himself unnerved by the fleeing shadow of the trouble which had not caused him to flinch so long as it faced him. On the morning and at the moment when Mary Hennessy was pushing open the scullery door of the house in Welch's Court, and was about to come upon the body of the forlorn old man lying there in his nightdress, Richard sat eating his breakfast in a silent and preoccupied mood. He had retired very late the previous night, and his lackluster eyes showed the effect of insufficient sleep. His single fellow boarder, Mr. Pinkham, had not returned from his customary early walk, and only Richard and Mrs. Spooner, the landlady, were at table. The former was in the act of lifting the coffee cup to his lips when the schoolmaster burst excitedly into the room. "Old Mr. Shackford is dead!" he exclaimed, dropping into a chair near the door. "There's a report down in the village that he had been murdered. I don't know if it's true. God forgive my abruptness. I didn't think." And Mr. Pinkham turned an apologetic face towards Richard, who sat there deathly pale, holding the cup rigidly within an inch or two of his lip, and staring blankly into space like a statue. I ought to have reflected," murmured the schoolmaster, covered with confusion at his maladroitness. "It was very reprehensible in Craggy to make such an announcement to me so suddenly on a street corner. I was quite upset by it." Richard pushed back his chair without replying, and passed into the hall, where he encountered a messenger from Mr. Slocum, confirming Mr. Pinkham's intelligence, but supplementing it with the rumor that Lemuel Shackford had committed suicide. Richard caught up his hat from a table and hurried to Welch's Court. Before reaching the house he had somewhat recovered his outward composure, but he was still pale and internally much agitated, for he had received a great shock, as Lawyer Perkins afterwards observed to Mr. Ward in the reading-room of the tavern. Both these gentlemen were present when Richard arrived, as were also several of the immediate neighbors and 2 constables. The latter were guarding the door against the crowd, which had already begun to collect in the front yard. A knot of carpenters, with their toolboxes on their shoulders, had halted at the garden gate on their way to Bishop's new stables, and were glancing curiously at the unpainted façade of the house, which seemed to have taken on a remote, bewildered expression, as if it had an inarticulate sense of the horror within. The men ceased their whispered conversation as Richard approached, and respectfully moved aside to let him pass. Nothing had been changed in the cheerless room on the ground floor, with its veneered mahogany furniture and its yellowish leprous wall-paper, peeling off at the seams here and there. A cane-seated chair, overturned near the table, had been left untouched, and the body was still lying in the position in which the Hennessy girl had discovered it. A strange chill, something unlike any atmospherical sharpness, a chill that seemed to exhale from the thin, pinched nostrils, permeated the apartment. The orioles were singing madly outside, their vermilion bosoms glowing like live coals against the tender green of the foliage, and appearing to break into flame as they took sudden flights hither and thither. But within all was still. On entering the chamber, Richard was smitten by the silence, that silence which shrouds the dead, and is like no other. Lemuel Shackford had not been kind or cousinly. He had blighted Richard's childhood with harshness and neglect, and had lately heaped cruel insult upon him. But as he stood there alone, and gazed for a moment at the firmly shut lips, upon which the mysterious white dust of death had already settled, the lips that were never to utter any more bitter things, the tears gathered in Richard's eyes and ran slowly down his cheeks. After all said and done, Lemuel Shackford was his kinsman, and blood is thicker than water. Coroner Whidden shortly appeared on the scene, accompanied by a number of persons. A jury was impaneled, and then began that inquest which resulted in shedding so very little light on the catastrophe. The investigation completed, there were endless details to attend to, papers to be hurriedly examined and sealed, and arrangements made for the funeral on the succeeding day. These matters occupied Richard until late in the afternoon, when he retired to his lodgings, looking in on Margaret for a few minutes on his way home. "This is too dreadful," said Margaret, clinging to his hand, with fingers nearly as icy as his own. "It is unspeakably sad," answered Richard, "the saddest thing I ever knew." Who could have been so cruel?" Richard shook his head. "No one knows." The funeral took place on Thursday, and on Friday morning, as has been stated, Mr. Taggett arrived in Stillwater, and installed himself in Welch's Court, to the wonder of many in the village, who would not have slept a night in that house, with only a servant in the north gable, for half the universe. Mr. Taggett was a person who did not allow himself to be swayed by his imagination. Here then he began his probing of a case which, on the surface, promised to be a very simple one. The man who had been seen driving rapidly along the turnpike sometime near daybreak on Wednesday was presumably the man who could tell him all about it. But it did not prove so. Neither Thomas Blufton nor William Durgin, nor any of the tramps subsequently obliged to drop into autobiography, could be connected with the affair. These first failures served to stimulate Mr. Taggett. It required a complex case to stir his ingenuity and sagacity. That the present was not a complex case he was still convinced, after 4 days' futile labor upon it. Mr. Shackford had been killed, either with malice prepense or on the spur of the moment, for his money. The killing had likely enough not been premeditated. The old man had probably opposed the robbery. Now, among the exceptionally rough population of the town, there were possibly 50 men who would not have hesitated to strike down Mr. Shackford if he had caught them flagrante delicto and resisted them, or attempted to call for succor. That the crime was committed by someone in Stillwater or in the neighborhood, Mr. Taggett had never doubted since the day of his arrival. The clumsy manner in which the staple had been wrenched from the scullery door showed the absence of a professional hand. Then the fact that the deceased was in the habit of keeping money in his bedchamber was a fact well known in the village, and not likely to be known outside of it, though of course it might have been. It was clearly necessary for Mr. Taggett to carry his investigation into the workshops and among the haunts of the class which was indubitably to furnish him with the individual he wanted. Above all, it was necessary that the investigation should be secret. An obstacle obtruded itself here. Everybody in Stillwater knew everybody, and a stranger appearing on the streets or dropping frequently into the tavern would not escape comment. The man with the greatest facility for making the requisite searches would of course be some workman, but a workman was the very agent not to be employed under the circumstances. How many times and by what strange fatality had a guilty party been selected to shadow his own movements or those of an accomplice? No, Mr. Taggett must rely only on himself, and his plan forthwith matured. Its execution, however, was delayed several days, the cooperation of Mr. Slocum and Mr. Richard Shackford being indispensable. At this stage Richard went to New York, where his cousin had made extensive investments in real estate. For a careful man, the late Mr. Shackford had allowed his affairs there to become strangely tangled. The business would detain Richard a fortnight. 3 days after his departure, Mr. Taggett himself left Stillwater, having apparently given up the case, a proceeding which was severely criticized, not only in the columns of the Stillwater Gazette, but by the townsfolk at large, who immediately relapsed into a state of apprehension approximating that of the morning when the crime was discovered. Mr. Pinkham, who was taking tea that evening at the Danas, threw the family into a panic by asserting his belief that this was merely the first of a series of artistic assassinations in the manner of those memorable murders recorded by De Quincey. Mr. Pinkham may have said this to impress the 4 Dana girls with the variety of his reading, but the recollection of De Quincey's harrowing paper had the effect of so unhinging the young schoolmaster that when he found himself, an hour or 2 afterwards, in the lonely, unlighted street, he flitted home like a belated ghost, and was ready to drop at every tree box. The next forenoon a new hand was taken on at Slocum's Yard. The new hand, who had come on foot from South Millville, at which town he had been set down by the 7 o'clock express that morning, was placed in the apprentice department. There were 5 or 6 apprentices now. Though all this was part of an understood arrangement, Mr. Slocum nearly doubted the fidelity of his own eyes when Mr. Taggett, a smooth-faced young fellow of 21, if so old, with all the traits of an ordinary workman down to the neglected fingernails, stepped up to the desk to have the name of Blake entered on the payroll. Either by chance or by design, Mr. Taggett had appeared but seldom on the streets of Stillwater. The few persons who had anything like familiar intercourse with him in his professional capacity were precisely the persons with whom his present movements were not likely to bring him into juxtaposition, and he ran slight risk of recognition by others. With his hair closely cropped and the overhanging brown mustache removed, the man was not so much disguised as transformed. "I shouldn't have known him," muttered Mr. Slocum, as he watched Mr. Taggett passing from the office with his hat in his hand. During the ensuing 10 or 12 days, Mr. Slocum never wholly succeeded in extricating himself from the foggy uncertainty generated by that one brief interview. From the moment Mr. Taggett was assigned a bench under the sheds, Mr. Slocum saw little or nothing of him. Mr. Taggett took lodging in a room in one of the most crowded of the low boarding-houses, a room accommodating 2 beds besides his own, the first occupied by a brother neophyte in marble-cutting, and the second by a morose, middle-aged man with one eyebrow a trifle higher than the other, as if it had been wrenched out of line by the strain of habitual intoxication. This man's name was Wollaston, and he worked at Dana's. Mr. Taggett's initial move was to make himself popular in the marble yard, and especially at the tavern, where he spent money freely, though not so freely as to excite any remark, except that the lad was running through pretty much all of his small pay, a recklessness which was charitably condoned in Snelling's barroom. He formed multifarious friendships, and had so many sensible views on the labor problem, advocating the general extinguishment of capitalists, and so on, that his admittance to the Marble Workers' Association resolved itself into merely a question of time. The old prejudice against apprentices was already wearing off. The quiet, evasive man of few words was now a loquacious talker, holding his own with the hardest hitters, and very skillful in giving offense to no one. "Whoever picks up Blake for a fool," Dexter remarked one night, "will put him down again." Not a shadow of suspicion followed Mr. Taggett in his various comings and goings. He seemed merely a good-natured, intelligent devil, perhaps a little less devilish and a trifle more intelligent than the rest, but not otherwise different. Denevan, Peters, Dexter, Wilson, and others in and out of the Slocum clique were Blake's sworn friends. In brief, Mr. Taggett had the amplest opportunities to prosecute his studies. Only for a pained look, which sometimes laterally shot into his eyes as he worked at the bench, or as he walked alone in the street, one would have imagined that he was thoroughly enjoying the half-vagabond existence. The supposition would have been erroneous, for in the progress of those 14 days' apprenticeship, Mr. Taggett had received a wound in the most sensitive part of his nature. He had been forced to give up what no man ever relinquishes without a wrench, his own idea. With the exception of an accident in Dana's mill, by which Torrini's hand had been so badly mangled that amputation was deemed necessary, the 2 weeks had been eventless outside of Mr. Taggett's personal experience. What that experience was will transpire in its proper place. Margaret was getting daily notes from Richard, and Mr. Slocum, overburdened with the secret of Mr. Taggett's presence in the yard, a secret confined exclusively to Mr. Slocum, Richard, and Justice Beemis, was restlessly awaiting developments. The developments came that afternoon, when Mr. Taggett walked into the office and startled Mr. Slocum, sitting at the desk. The two words which Mr. Taggett then gravely and coldly whispered in Mr. Slocum's ear were, "Richard Shackford." End of chapter 18. The Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 19. Mr. Slocum, who had partly risen from the chair, sank back into his seat.
"Good God!"
he said, turning very pale.
"Are you mad?"
Mr. Taggett realized the cruel shock which the pronouncing of that name must have caused Mr. Slocum. Mr. Taggett had meditated his line of action, and had decided that the most merciful course was brusquely to charge young Shackford with the crime, and allow Mr. Slocum to sustain himself for a while with the indignant disbelief which would be natural to him, situated as he was. He would then in a manner be prepared for the revelations which, if suddenly presented, would crush him. If Mr. Taggett was without imagination, as he claimed, he was not without a certain feminine quickness of sympathy, often found in persons engaged in professions calculated to blunt the finer sensibilities. In his intercourse with Mr. Slocum at the Shackford house, Mr. Taggett had been won by the singular gentleness and simplicity of the man, and was touched by his misfortune. After his exclamation, Mr. Slocum did not speak for a moment or two, but with his elbows resting on the edge of the desk, sat motionless, like a person stunned. Then he slowly lifted his face, to which the color had returned, and making a movement with his right hand, as if he were sweeping away cobwebs in front of him, rose from the chair.
"You are simply mad,"
he said, looking Mr. Taggett squarely and calmly in the eyes.
"Are you aware of Mr. Richard Shackford's character and his position here?
"Precisely."
"Do you know that he is to marry my daughter?"
"I am very sorry for you, sir."
"You may spare me that. It is quite unnecessary. You have fallen into some horrible delusion. I hope you will be able to explain it."
"I am prepared to do so, sir."
"Are you serious?"
"Very serious, Mr. Slocum."
"You actually imagine that Richard Shackford— Pshaw! It is simply impossible."
"I am too young a man to wish even to seem wiser than you, but my experience has taught me that nothing is impossible."
"I begin to believe so myself. I suppose you have grounds, or something you consider grounds, for your monstrous suspicion. What are they? I demand to be fully informed of what you have been doing in the yard, before you bring disgrace upon me and my family by inconsiderately acting on some wild theory which perhaps 10 words can refute."
"I should be in the highest degree criminal, Mr. Slocum, if I were to make so fearful an accusation against any man, unless I had the most incontestable evidence in my hands." Mr. Taggett spoke with such cold-blooded conviction that a chill crept over Mr. Slocum, in spite of him.
"What is the nature of this evidence?"
"Up to the present stage, purely circumstantial."
"I can imagine that,"
said Mr. Slocum, with a slight smile. "But so conclusive as to require no collateral evidence. The testimony of an eyewitness of the crime could scarcely add to my knowledge of what occurred that Tuesday night in Lemuel Shackford's house."
"Indeed? Is it all so clear? But of course a few eyewitnesses will turn up eventually," said Mr. Slocum, whose whiteness about the lips discounted the assurance of his sarcasm. "That is not improbable," returned Mr. Taggett. "And meanwhile, what are the facts?"
"They are not easily stated. I have kept a record of my work day by day since the morning I entered the yard. The memoranda are necessarily confused, the important and the unimportant being jumbled together. But the record as it stands will answer your question more fully than I could, even if I had the time, which I have not, to go over the case with you. I can leave these notes in your hands if you desire it. When I return from New York—"
"You are going to New York?"
exclaimed Mr. Slocum with a start.
"When?"
"This evening."
"If you lay a finger on Richard Shackford, you will make the mistake of your life, Mr. Taggett."
"I have other business there. Mr. Shackford will be in Stillwater to-morrow night. He engaged a stateroom on the Fall River boat this morning."
"How can you know that?"
"Since last Tuesday, none of his movements have been unknown to me."
"Do you mean to say you have set your miserable spies upon him?"
cried Mr. Slocum. "I should not state the fact in just those words," Mr. Taggett answered. "The fact remains."
"Pardon me," said Mr. Slocum. "I am not quite myself. Can you wonder at it?"
I do not wonder.
Give me those papers you speak of, Mr. Taggett. I would like to look through them. I see that you are a very obstinate person when you have got a notion into your head. Perhaps I can help you out of your error before it is irreparable."
Then, after hesitating a second, Mr. Slocum added,
"I may speak of this to my daughter. Indeed, I should scarcely keep it from her."
"Perhaps it is better she should be informed."
"And Mr. Shackford, when he returns to-morrow?"
"If he broaches the subject of his cousin's death, I advise you to avoid it."
"Why should I?"
"It might save you or Miss Slocum some awkwardness, but you must use your own discretion. As the matter stands, it makes no difference whether Mr. Shackford knows his position to-day or to-morrow. It is too late for him to avail himself of the knowledge. Otherwise, of course, I should not have given myself away in this fashion."
"Very well,"
said Mr. Slocum, with an impatient movement of his shoulders.
"Neither I nor my daughter will open our lips on this topic. In the meanwhile, you are to take no further steps without advising me. That is understood?"
"That is perfectly understood," returned Mr. Taggett, drawing a narrow red notebook from the inner pocket of his workman's blouse, and producing at the same time a small nickel-plated door key. "This is the key of Mr. Shackford's private workshop in the extension. I have not been able to replace it on the mantel-shelf of his sitting-room in Lime Street. Will you have the kindness to see that it is done at once?" A moment later Mr. Slocum stood alone in the office, with Mr. Taggett's diary in his hand. It was one of those costly little volumes, gilt-edged and bound in fragrant crushed Levant morocco, with which city officials are annually supplied by a community of grateful taxpayers. The dark crimson of the flexible covers, as soft and slippery to the touch as a snake's skin, was perhaps the fitting symbol of the darker story that lay coiled within. With a gesture of repulsion, as if some fancy had flitted through his mind, Mr. Slocum tossed the notebook on the desk in front of him, and stood a few minutes moodily watching the reflets of the crinkled leather as the afternoon sunshine struck across it. Beneath his amazement and indignation, he had been chilled to the bone by Mr. Taggett's brutal confidence. It was enough to chill one, surely, and in spite of himself, Mr. Slocum began to feel a certain indefinable dread of that little crimson-bound book. Whatever it contained, the reading of those pages was to be a repellent task to him. It was a task to which he could not bring himself at the moment. To-night, in the privacy of his own chamber, he would sift Mr. Taggett's baleful fancies. Thus temporizing, Mr. Slocum dropped the volume into his pocket, locked the office door behind him, and wandered down to Dundon's drugstore to kill the intervening hour before supper time. Dundon's was the aristocratic lounging place of the village, the place where the only genuine Havana cigars in Stillwater were to be had, and where the favored few, the initiated, could get a dash of Hockheimer or cognac with their soda water. At supper that evening, Mr. Slocum addressed scarcely a word to Margaret, and Margaret was also silent. The days were dragging heavily with her. She was missing Richard. Her own daring travels had never extended beyond Boston or Providence, and New York, with Richard in it, seemed drearily far away. Mr. Slocum withdrew to his chamber shortly after 9 o'clock, and lighting the pair of candles on the dressing-table, began his examination of Mr. Taggett's memoranda. At midnight, the watchman on his lonely beat saw those 2 candles still burning. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 20. Mr. Taggett's diary was precisely a diary, disjoined, full of curt, obscure phrases and irrelevant reflections, for which reason it will not be reproduced here. Though Mr. Slocum pondered every syllable, and now and then turned back painfully to reconsider some doubtful passage, it is not presumed that the reader will care to do so. An abstract of the journal, with occasional quotation where the writer's words seem to demand it, will be sufficient for the narrative. In the opening pages Mr. Taggett described his novel surroundings with a minuteness which contrasted oddly with the brief, hurried entries further on. He found himself, as he had anticipated, in a society composed of some of the most heterogeneous elements. Stillwater, viewed from a certain point, was a sort of microcosm, a little international rag fair to which nearly every country on earth had contributed one of its shabby human products. "I am moving," wrote Mr. Taggett, "in an atmosphere in which any crime is possible. I give myself 7 days at the outside to light upon the traces of Shackford's murder. I feel him in the air." The writer's theory was that the man would betray his identity in one of two ways, either by talking unguardedly or by indulging in expenditures not warranted by his means and position. If several persons had been concerned in the crime, nothing was more likely than a disagreement over the spoil, and consequent treachery on the part of one of them. Or again, some of the confederates might become alarmed and attempt to save themselves by giving away their comrades. Mr. Taggett, however, leaned to the belief that the assassin had had no accomplices. The sum taken from Mr. Shackford's safe was a comparatively large one, $500 in gold, and nearly double that amount in banknotes. Neither the gold nor the paper bore any known mark by which it could be recognized. The burglar had doubtless assured himself of this, and would not hesitate to disperse the money. That was even a safer course, judiciously worked, than to secret it. The point was, would he have sufficient self-control to get rid of it by degrees? The chances, Mr. Taggett argued, were 10 to 1 he would not. A few pages further on, Mr. Taggett compliments the unknown on the adroit manner in which he is conducting himself. He has neither let slip a suspicious word, nor made an incautious display of his booty. Snelling's bar was doing an unusually light business. No one appeared to have any money. Many of the men had run deeply into debt during the late strike, and were now drinking moderately. In the paragraph which closes the week's record, Mr. Taggett's chagrin is evident. He confesses that he is at fault. "My invisible friend does not materialize so successfully as I expected," is Mr. Taggett's comment. His faith in the correctness of his theory had not abated, but he continued his observations in a less sanguine spirit. These observations were not limited to the bar-room or the workshop. He informed himself of the domestic surroundings of his comrades. Where his own scrutiny could not penetrate, he employed the aid of correspondence. He knew what workmen had money in the local savings bank, and the amount of each deposit. In the course of his explorations of the shady side of Stillwater life, Mr. Taggett unearthed many amusing and many pathetic histories, but nothing that served his end. Finally, he began to be discouraged. Returning home from the tavern one night in a rather desponding mood, he found the man Wollaston smoking his pipe in bed. Wollaston was a taciturn man generally, but this night he was conversational, and Mr. Taggett, too restless to sleep, fell to chatting with him. Did he know much about the late Mr. Shackford? Yes, he had known him well enough, in an off way, not to speak of him. Everybody knew him in Stillwater. He was a sort of miser, hated everybody, and bullied everybody. It was a wonder somebody didn't knock the old Silvertop on the head years ago. Thus Mr. Wollaston grimly, with his pores stopped up with iron fillings. A person to whom it would come quite easy to knock anyone on the head for a slight difference of opinion. He amused Mr. Taggett in his present humor. No, he wasn't aware that Shackford had had trouble with any particular individual. Believed he did have a difficulty once with Slocum, the marble man. But he was always fetching suits against the town and shying lawyers at the mill directors. A disagreeable old cuss altogether. Adopted his cousin one time, but made the house so hot for him that the lad ran off to sea, and since then had had nothing to do with the old bilk. Indeed, what sort of fellow was young Shackford? Mr. Wollaston could not say of his own knowledge, thought him a plucky chap. He had put a big Italian named Torrini out of the yard one day for talking back. Who was Torrini? The man that got hurt last week in the Dana Mill. Who were Richard Shackford's intimates? Couldn't say. Had seen him with Mr. Pinkham, the schoolmaster, and Mr. Craggy. Went with the upper crust generally. Was going to be a partner in the marble yard and marry Slocum's daughter. Will Durgin knew him. They lived together one time. He, Wollaston, was going to turn in now. Several of these facts were not new to Mr. Taggett, but Mr. Wollaston's presentation of them threw Mr. Taggett into a reverie. The next evening he got Durgin alone in a corner of the bar-room. With 2 or 3 potations Durgin became autobiographical. Was he acquainted with Mr. Shackford outside the yard? Rather. Dick Shackford? His, Durgin's mother, had kept Dick from starving when he was a baby, and no thanks for it. Went to school with him, and knew all about his running off to sea. Was near going with him. Old man Shackford never liked Dick, who was a proud beggar. They couldn't pull together, down to the last, both of a piece. They had a jolly rumpus a little while before the old man was fixed. Mr. Taggett pricked up his ears at this. A rumpus? How did Durgin know that? A girl told him. What girl? A girl he was sweet on. What was her name? Well, he didn't mind telling her name. It was Molly Hennessy. She was going through Welch's Court one forenoon, maybe it was 3 days before the strike, and saw Dick Shackford bolt out of the house, swinging his arms and swearing to himself at an awful rate. Was Durgin certain that Molly Hennessey had told him this? Yes, he was ready to take his oath on it. Here at last was something that looked like a glimmer of daylight. It was possible that Durgin or the girl had lied, but the story had an air of truth to it. If it were a fact that there had recently been a quarrel between these cousins, whose uncousinly attitude towards each other was fast becoming clear to Mr. Taggett, then here was a conceivable key to an enigma which had puzzled him. The conjecture that Lemuel Shackford had himself torn up the will, if it was a will, for this still remained in dispute, had never been satisfactory to Mr. Taggett. He had accepted it because he was unable to imagine an ordinary burglar pausing in the midst of his work to destroy a paper in which he could have no concern. But Richard Shackford would have the liveliest possible interest in the destruction of a document that placed a vast estate beyond his reach. Here was a motive on a level with the crime. That money had been taken, and that the fragments of the will had been carelessly thrown into a wastepaper basket, just as if the old man himself had thrown them there, was a stroke of art which Mr. Taggett admired more and more as he reflected upon it. He did not, however, allow himself too much stress on these points, for the paper might turn out to be merely an expired lease, and the girl might have been quizzing Durgin. Mr. Taggett would have given one of his eye-teeth just then for 10 minutes with Mary Hennessey, but an interview with her at this stage was neither prudent nor easily compassed. "If I have not struck a trail," writes Mr. Taggett, "I have come upon what strongly resembles one. The least I can do is follow it. My first move must be to inspect that private workshop in the rear of Mr. Slocum's house. How shall I accomplish it? I cannot apply to him for permission, for that would provoke questions which I am not ready to answer. Moreover, I have yet to assure myself that Mr. Slocum is not implicated. There seems to have been also a hostile feeling existing between him and the deceased. Why didn't someone tell me these things at the start? If young Shackford is the person, there is a tangled story to be unraveled. Memo: young Shackford is Miss Slocum's lover." Mr. Slocum read this passage twice without drawing breath, and then laid down the book an instant to wipe the sudden perspiration from his forehead. In the note which followed, Mr. Taggett described the difficulty he met with in procuring a key to fit the wall door at the rear of the marble yard, and gave an account of his failure to effect an entrance into the studio. He had hoped to find a window unfastened, but the window, as well as the door opening upon the veranda, was locked, and in the midst of his operations, which were conducted at noontime, the approach of a servant had obliged him to retreat. Forced to lay aside, at least temporarily, his designs on the workshop, he turned his attention to Richard's lodgings in Lime Street. Here Mr. Taggett was more successful. On the pretext that he had been sent for certain drawings which were to be found on the table or in a writing desk, he was permitted by Mrs. Spooner to ascend to the bedroom, where she obligingly insisted on helping him search for the apocryphal plans, and seriously interfered with his purpose, which was to find the key of the studio. While Mr. Taggett was turning over the pages of a large dictionary in order to gain time, and was wondering how he could rid himself of the old lady's importunities, he came upon a half-folded note-sheet, at the bottom of which his eye caught the name of Lemuel Shackford. It was in the handwriting of the dead man. Mr. Taggett was very familiar with that handwriting. He secured the paper at a venture, and put it in his pocket without examination. A few minutes later, it being impossible to prolong the pretended quest for the drawings, Mr. Taggett was obliged to follow Mrs. Spooner from the apartment. As he did so, he noticed a bright object lying on the corner of the mantel-shelf, a small nickel-plated key. In order to take it, he had only to reach out his hand in passing. It was, as Mr. Taggett had instantly surmised, the key of Richard's workshop. If it had been gold instead of brass or iron, that bit of metal would have taken no additional value in Mr. Taggett's eyes. On leaving Mrs. Spooner's, he held it tightly clasped in his fingers until he reached an unfrequented street, where he halted a moment in the shadow of a building to inspect the paper which he had half forgotten in his satisfaction at having obtained the key. A stifled cry rose to Mr. Taggett's lips as he glanced over the crumpled note-sheet. It contained 3 lines, hastily scrawled in lead pencil, requesting Richard Shackford to call at the house in Welch's Court at 8 o'clock on a certain Tuesday night. The note had been written, as the date showed, on the day preceding the Tuesday night in question, the night of the murder. For a second or two, Mr. Taggett stood, paralyzed. 10 minutes afterwards, a message in cipher was pulsing along the wires to New York, and before the sun went down that evening, Richard Shackford was under the surveillance of the police. The doubtful, unknown ground upon which Mr. Taggett had been floundering was now firm under his feet. Unexpected ground, but solid. Meeting Mary Hennessey in the street, on his way to the marble yard, Mr. Taggett no longer hesitated to accost her, and question her as to the story she had told William Durgin. The girl's story was undoubtedly true, and as a piece of circumstantial evidence was only less important than the elder Shackford's note. The two cousins had been for years on the worst of terms. At every step Mr. Taggett had found corroboration of Wollaston's statement to that effect. "Where were the coroner Whidden's eyes and ears?" wrote Mr. Taggett. The words were dashed down impatiently on the page, as if he had sworn a little internally while writing them. "When he conducted that inquest? In all my experience there was never a thing so stupidly managed." A thorough and immediate examination of Richard Shackford's private workshop was now so imperative that Mr. Taggett resolved to make it even if he had to do so under the authority of a search warrant. But he desired as yet to avoid publicity. A secret visit to the studio seemed equally difficult by day and night. In the former case he was nearly certain to be deranged by the servants, and in the latter a light in the unoccupied room would alarm any of the household who might chance to awaken. From the watchman no danger was to be apprehended, as the windows of the extension were not visible from the street. Mr. Taggett finally decided on the night as the more propitious time for his attempt, a decision which his success justified. A brilliant moon favored the indoor part of the enterprise, though it exposed him to observation in his approach from the marble yard to the veranda. With the dense moonlight streaming outside against the window shades, he could safely have used a candle in the studio instead of the screened lantern which he had provided. Mr. Taggett passed 3 hours in the workshop, the last hour in waiting for the moon to go down. Then he stole through the marble yard into the silent street, and hurried home, carrying 2 small articles concealed under his blouse. The first was a chisel with a triangular piece broken out of the center of the bevel, and the other was a box of safety matches. The peculiarity of this box of matches was that just 1 match had been used from it. Mr. Taggett's work was done. The last 7 pages of the diary were devoted to a review of the case, every detail of which was held up in various lights and examined with the conscientious pains of a lapidary deciding on the value of a rare stone. The concluding entries ran as follow: Tuesday night. Here the case passes into other hands. I have been fortunate rather than skillful in unmasking the chief actor in one of the most singular crimes that ever came under my investigation. By destroying 3 objects, very easily destroyed, Richard Shackford would have put himself beyond the dream of suspicion. He neglected to remove these dumb witnesses, and now the dumb witnesses speak. If it could be shown that he was 100 miles from Stillwater at the time of the murder, instead of in the village, as he was, he must still be held, in the face of the proofs against him, accessory to the deed. These proofs, roughly summarized, are: First, the fact that he had had an altercation with his cousin a short time previous to the date of the murder, a murder which may be regarded not as the result of a chance disagreement, but of long years of bitter enmity between the 2 men. Secondly, the fact that Richard Shackford had had an appointment with his cousin on the night the crime was committed, and had concealed that fact from the authorities at the time of the coroner's inquest. Thirdly, that the broken chisel found in the private workshop of the accused explains the peculiar shape of the wound which caused Lemuel Shackford's death, and corresponds in every particular with the plaster impression taken of that wound. Fourthly, that the partially consumed match found on the scullery floor when the body was discovered, a style of match not used in the house in Welch's Court, completes the complement of a box of safety matches belonging to Richard Shackford and hidden in a closet in his workshop. Whether Shackford had an accomplice or not is yet to be ascertained. There is nothing whatever to implicate Mr. Roland Slocum. I make the statement because his intimate association with one party and his deep dislike of the other invited inquiry, and at first raised an unjust suspicion in my mind. The little red book slipped from Mr. Slocum's grasp and fell at his feet. As he rose from the chair, the reflection which he caught of himself in the dressing-table mirror was that of a wrinkled, white old man. Mr. Slocum did not believe, and no human evidence could have convinced him, that Richard had deliberately killed Lemuel Shackford. But as Mr. Slocum reached the final pages of the diary, a horrible probability insinuated itself in his mind. Could Richard have done it accidentally? Could he, in an instant of passion, stung to sudden madness by that venomous old man, have struck him involuntarily and killed him? A certain speech which Richard had made in Mr. Slocum's presence not long before came back to him now with fearful emphasis. 3 or 4 times in my life I have been carried away by a devil of a temper, which I couldn't control. It seized me so unawares. It seized me so unawares, repeated Mr. Slocum, half aloud, and then with a swift, unconscious gesture he pressed his hands over his ears, as if to shut out the words. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 21. Margaret must be told. It would be like stabbing her to tell her all this. Mr. Slocum had lain awake long after midnight, appalled by the calamity that was about to engulf them. At moments, as his thought reverted to Margaret's illness early in the spring, he felt that perhaps it would have been a mercy if she had died then. He had left the candles burning. It was not until the wicks sunk down in the sockets and went softly out that slumber fell upon him. He was now sitting at the breakfast table, absently crumbling bits of bread beside his plate and leaving his coffee untouched. Margaret glanced at him wistfully from time to time, and detected the restless night in the deepened lines of his face. The house had not been the same since Lemuel Shackford's death. He had never crossed its threshold. Margaret had scarcely known him by sight, and Mr. Slocum had not spoken to him for years. But Richard's connection with the unfortunate old man had brought the tragic event very close to Margaret and her father. Mr. Slocum was a person easily depressed, but his depression this morning was so greatly in excess of the presumable cause that Margaret began to be troubled. "Papa, has anything happened?"
No, nothing new has happened, but I am dreadfully disturbed by some things which Mr. Taggett has been doing here in the village.
"I thought Mr. Taggett had gone."
He did go, but he came back very quietly without anybody's knowledge. I knew it, of course, but no one else to speak of.
"What has he done to disturb you?"
I want you to be a brave girl, Margaret. Will you promise that?
"Why, yes," said Margaret with an anxious look. "You frighten me with your mysteriousness."
I do not mean to be mysterious, but I don't quite know how to tell you about Mr. Taggett. He has been working underground in this matter of poor Shackford's death, boring into the dark, like a mole, and thinks he has discovered some strange things.
"Do you mean he thinks he has found out who killed Mr. Shackford?"
He believes he has fallen upon clues which lead to that. The strange things I alluded to are things which Richard will have to explain.
"Richard? What has he to do with it?"
Not much, I hope. But there are several matters which he will be obliged to clear up in order to save himself from very great annoyance. Mr. Taggett seems to think that...
"Good heavens, Papa! What does he think?"
Margaret, he thinks that Richard knew something about the murder and has not told it.
"What could he know? Is that all?"
No, that is not all. I am keeping the full truth from you, and it is useless to do so. You must face it like a brave girl. Mr. Taggett suspects Richard of being concerned, directly or indirectly, with the crime."
The color went from Margaret's cheek for an instant. The statement was too horrible and sudden not to startle her, but it was also too absurd to have more than an instant's effect. Her quick recovery of herself reassured Mr. Slocum. Would she meet Mr. Taggett's specific charges with the like fortitude? Mr. Slocum himself had been prostrated by them. He prayed to heaven that Margaret might have more strength than he, as indeed she had.
"The man has got together a lot of circumstantial evidence," continued Mr. Slocum cautiously. "Some of it amounts to nothing, being mere conjecture, but some of it will look badly for Richard, to outsiders."
"Of course it is all a mistake," said Margaret in nearly her natural voice. "It ought to be easy to convince Mr. Taggett of that."
"I have not been able to convince him."
"But you will. What has possessed him to fall into such a ridiculous error?"
"Mr. Taggett has written out everything at length in his memorandum book, and you must read it for yourself. There are expressions and statements in these pages, Margaret, that will necessarily shock you very much. But you should remember, as I tried to while reading them, that Mr. Taggett has a heart of steel. Without it he would be unable to do his distressing work. The cold impartiality with which he sifts and heaps up circumstances involving the doom of a fellow creature appears almost inhuman. But it is his business." "No, do not look at it here," said Mr. Slocum, recoiling, as he had given the book to Margaret. "Take it into the other room and read it carefully by yourself. When you have finished, come back and tell me what you think."
"But, Papa, surely you—"
"I don't believe anything, Margaret. I don't know the truth from the false any more. I want you to help me out of my confusion, and you cannot do it until you have read that book."
Margaret made no response, but passed into the parlor and closed the folding doors behind her. After an absence of half an hour, she re-entered the breakfast room, and laid Mr. Taggett's diary on the table beside her father, who had not moved from his place during the interval. Margaret's manner was collected, but it was evident, by the dark circles under her eyes and the set, colorless lips, that half hour had been a cruel 30 minutes to her. In Margaret's self-possession, Mr. Slocum recognized, not for the first time, the cropping out of an ancestral trait which had somehow managed to avoid him in its wayward descent.
"Well?"
he questioned, looking earnestly at Margaret, and catching a kind of comfort from her confident bearing. "It is Mr. Taggett's trade to find somebody guilty," said Margaret, "and he has been very ingenious and very merciless. He was plainly at his wits' end to sustain his reputation, and would not have hesitated to sacrifice anyone rather than wholly fail."
"But you have been crying, Margaret."
"How could I see Richard dragged down in the dust in this fashion, and not be mortified and indignant?"
"You don't believe anything at all of this?"
"Do you?" asked Margaret, looking through and through him.
"I confess I am troubled."
"If you doubt Richard for a second," said Margaret, with a slight quiver of her lip, "that will be the bitterest part of it to me."
"I don't give any more credit to Mr. Taggett's general charges than you do, Margaret, but I understand their gravity better. A perfectly guiltless man, when able with a single word to establish his innocence, is necessarily crushed at first by an accusation of this kind. Now, can Richard set these matters right with a single word? I am afraid he has a world of difficulty before him."
"When he returns he will explain everything. How can you question it?"
"I do not wish to. But there are two things in Mr. Taggett's story which stagger me. The motive for the destruction of Shackford's papers. That's not plain. The box of matches is a puerility unworthy of a clever man like Mr. Taggett. And as to the chisel he found, why, there are 100 broken chisels in the village, and probably a score of them broken in precisely the same manner. But, Margaret, did Richard ever breathe a word to you of that quarrel with his cousin?"
"No."
"He never mentioned it to me either. As matters stood between you and him, nothing was more natural than he should have spoken of it to you. So natural that his silence is positively strange."
"He may have considered it too unimportant. Mr. Shackford always abused Richard. It was nothing new. Then again, Richard is very proud, and perhaps he did not care to come to us just at that time with family grievances. Besides, how do we know they quarreled? The village is full of gossip."
"I am certain there was a quarrel. It was only necessary for those two to meet to ensure that. I distinctly remember the forenoon when Richard went to Welch's Court. It was the day he discharged Torrini."
A little cloud passed over Margaret's countenance.
"They undoubtedly had angry words together," continued Mr. Slocum, "and we are forced to accept the Hennessy girl's statement. The reason you suggest for Richard's not saying anything on the subject may suffice for us, but it will scarcely satisfy disinterested persons, and doesn't at all cover another circumstance which must be taken in the same connection."
"What circumstance?"
"His silence in regard to Lemuel Shackford's note, a note written the day before the murder, and making an appointment for the very night of it."
The girl looked steadily at her father.
"Margaret!"
exclaimed Mr. Slocum, his face illuminated with a flickering hope as he met her untroubled gaze.
"Did Richard tell you?"
"No," replied Margaret.
"Then he told no one,"
said Mr. Slocum, with the light fading out of his features again.
"It was madness in him to conceal the fact. He should not have lost a moment after the death of his cousin in making that letter public. It ought instantly to have been placed in Coroner Whidden's hands. Richard's action is inconceivable, unless...
"Do not say it!" cried Margaret. "I should never forgive you." In recapitulating the points of Mr. Taggett's accusation, Mr. Slocum had treated most of them as trivial, but he had not been sincere. He knew that the broken chisel had no duplicate in Stillwater, and that the finding of it in Richard's closet was a black fact. Mr. Slocum had also glossed over the quarrel, but that letter, the likelihood that Richard kept the appointment, and his absolute silence concerning it, here was a grim thing which no sophistry could dispose of. It would be wronging Margaret to deceive her as to the vital seriousness of Richard's position.
Why did he hide it?" Mr. Slocum persisted.
"I do not see that he really hid it, Papa. He shut the note in a book lying open on the table, a dictionary, to which anyone in the household was likely to go. You think Mr. Taggett a person of great acuteness."
"He is a very intelligent person, Margaret."
"He appears to me very short-sighted. If Richard were the dreadful man Mr. Taggett supposes, that paper would have been burnt and not left for the first comer to pick up. I scorn myself for stooping to the suggestion."
"There is something in the idea," said Mr. Slocum slowly. "But why did Richard never mention the note? To you, or to me, or to anybody?"
"He had a sufficient reason, you may be sure. Oh, papa, how ready you are to believe evil of him!"
"I am not, God knows."
"How you cling to this story of the letter! Suppose it turns out to be some old letter, written 2 or 3 years ago. You could never look Richard in the face again."
"Unfortunately, Shackford dated it. It is useless for us to blindfold ourselves, Margaret. Richard has managed in some way to get himself into a very perilous situation, and we cannot help him by shutting our eyes. You misconceive me if you imagine I think him capable of coolly plotting his cousin's death, but it is not outside the limits of the possible that what has happened 1,000 times may have happened once more. Men less impulsive than Richard—"
"I will not listen to it," interrupted Margaret, drawing herself up. "When Richard returns he will explain the matter to you, not to me. If I required a word of denial from him, I should care very little whether he was innocent or not." Mr. Slocum threw a terrified glance at his daughter. Her lofty faith sent a chill to his heart. What would be the result of a fall from such a height? He almost wished Margaret had something less of that ancestral confidence and obstinacy, the lack of which in his own composition he had so often deplored.
"We are not going to speak of this to Richard," he said after a protracted pause. "At least not until Mr. Taggett considers it best. I have pledged myself to something like that."
"Has Richard been informed of Mr. Taggett's singular proceeding?" asked Margaret freezingly.
"Not yet. Nothing is to be done until Mr. Taggett returns from New York, and then Richard will at once have an opportunity of clearing himself."
"It would have spared us all much pain and misunderstanding if he had been sent for in the first instance. Did he know that this person was here in the yard?"
"The plan was talked over before Richard left. The details were arranged afterwards. He heartily approved of the plan."
A leisurely and not altogether saint-like smile crept into the corners of Margaret's mouth.
"Yes, he approved of the plan," replied Mr. Slocum. "Perhaps he—"
Here Mr. Slocum checked himself, and left the sentence flying at loose ends. Perhaps Richard had looked with favor upon a method of inquiry which was so likely to lead to no result. But Mr. Slocum did not venture to finish the suggestion. He had never seen Margaret so imperious and intractable. It was impossible to reason or talk frankly with her. He remained silent, sitting with one arm thrown dejectedly across the back of the chair. Presently his abject attitude and expression began to touch Margaret. There was something that appealed to her in the thin gray hair fallowing over his forehead. Her eyes softened as they rested upon him, and a pitying little tremor came to her under lip. "Papa," she said, stooping to his side, with a sudden rosy bloom in her cheeks, "I have all the proof I want that Richard knew nothing of this dreadful business."
"You have proof?"
exclaimed Mr. Slocum, starting from his seat. "Yes. The morning Richard went to New York—" Margaret hesitated.
"Well?"
"He put his arm around me and kissed me."
"Well?"
"Well," repeated Margaret. "Could Richard have done that? Could he have so much as laid his hand upon me if— Mr. Slocum sunk back into the chair with a kind of groan. "Papa, you do not know him."
"Oh, Margaret, I am afraid that is not the kind of evidence to clear Richard in Mr. Taggett's eyes."
"Then Richard's word must do it," she said haughtily. "He will be home to-night."
"Yes, he is to return to-night," said Mr. Slocum, looking away from her.
End of chapter 21.